Corporate boards are no longer simply a legal structure, but a body of humans in the spotlight. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors and discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future ready. On this episode, Friso van der Oord, NACD Senior Vice President of Content, and Peter Gleason, NACD President and CEO, discuss the evolution of board governance, both within the boardroom and externally through the eyes of new and varied stakeholders. They'll also look forward and discuss what boards and individual directors will look like in the future. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Thanks for joining our NACD's BoardVision podcast today. Peter Gleason, our CEO at the National Association for Corporate Directors, is here with us, not only as the leader of our organization, but truly as our expert, a truth teller who's been in the world of governance for 35 years. He's going to help us demystify what happens inside boardrooms, what truly is corporate governance, what is not. He'll share his personal experiences and observations. He's a tour de force. He's worked with investors, within the proxy advisory world, with NACD, and with many, many directors and boards over the last few decades. Very excited to have you, Peter, and we'll jump right in.
Great. Thanks, Friso.
So how did you end up in this career, right? In the 1990s, this probably wasn't an obvious career choice.
No, it wasn't an obvious career choice. I had a friend who ran sales for institutional shareholder services, and he hired me as a contractor to do sales with him, which I didn't know anything about at the time. I was fresh out of college and trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I got interested in the research that we were selling more so than the sales itself, and found my way into a temporary job in the research department, which turned into, thanks to Nell Minow, who was the president of ISS at the time, turned into a full-time job as an analyst. And I just kind of worked my way through the analyst ranks at ISS over the years to the point where I was running the research department when I left just about 8 years, a little less than 8 years later. Went on to do some corporate consulting, and everywhere I went in the corporate consulting world, people wanted to know about corporate governance issues and proxy issues. So I thought I ought to get back into it, and found my way to NACD, which was under new leadership, brand new leadership, when I had approached NACD and came in as the director of research. So I had your job in a way, Friso, when I first started at NACD.
That's right, and you did a good job of it too. So you've been in it for many decades. What keeps you fascinated, right? At times, board governance, corporate governance can seem somewhat arcane, abstract. What keeps you fulfilled in this space?
It really is the fact that it changes all the time. Besides the fact that I got to build a business and now I get to run that business, the dynamics of corporate governance have changed so dramatically over my tenure here that it keeps it fascinating. If you think back to the early 90s, when I started in the proxy world, proxies were 15 pages long. Most of the proxies were the election of directors and the ratification of auditors. It moved on if you had big compensation issues, but this is, again, it was pre-Dodd-Frank, so the focus on compensation was from the institutional investor side of the house. And that's where you got, and even those were minimal disclosures about the compensation plans. Then you got into M&A and they got a little bit bigger. And then you got into proxy contests, which were in their infancy back then. We had dissident shareholders, not activist shareholders. And I got to evaluate that. But since I've been at NACD the last 23 plus years, we've seen federal law be put into place. We've seen a whole different focus on the boardroom, not just from the investor community, but from the corporate community, from the legal community, from the media, et cetera. Everyone is focused in on, what's the board's role and what are they doing here in whatever scenario has unfolded at the company.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, boards are no longer just a legal structure, right? Hidden in a black box. It's a body of humans, right? And they're in the spotlight and they need to be dynamic. You're absolutely right. It's a fast changing space. One question I always wanted to ask you, Peter, since you've been with the NACD working so closely with these movers or shakers in the boardroom, right? Former CEOs, board leaders, major investors. How has that impacted your own leadership and maybe view of business, right? At such a young age, you got to work with these notable figures. Most people don't get a chance to do that until they're well in their 50s, 60s.
Yeah, well, I'm well into my 50s now, Friso, but I appreciate the question. It really has been remarkable. And it's one of those, you count your blessings, right? It doesn't always seem like it's a clear path, but you meet incredible people along the way. And I think about the luminaries, including Ken West, who chaired the board of NACD when I was brand new here, Roger Raber, who was the CEO, Ken Daly, who was my predecessor, Ira Milstein, Nell Minow, I mentioned earlier, who's been a force in the governance, mostly on the shareholder side, but really has transformed the way we think about corporate governance. And then I think about all the institutional investors that I've had the opportunity to work with, in addition to the CEOs and the board members over the years. How it's impacted my leadership is really one of the things I truly count as an opportunity in my career was to have different people that I worked for with different leadership styles, and then to be able to listen to them interact with other leaders. And now in my position, having that opportunity to interact with others. So just a recent example, I was at a conference last week in Rhode Island, and we started talking about culture and how this was an AI conference, but somehow the question came up about culture and how you manifest different ideas within the organization. And I had the opportunity to reflect and tell the story to this audience about some impacts that I've had here at NACD in my leadership and things that have changed the way I looked at different issues. And it always brings me back to the learnings I had from those that were ahead of me and the people that I, again, had the opportunity to work with over the years and how they would have reacted to different things that I've been presented with. So it's that constant growth that I think is important for any leader to continuously learn and think differently about, what you may have thought was the right approach. There's hundreds of leaders out there that may have a different approach, and you can learn from each one of them.
Yeah. Was there maybe one luminary leader, Peter, that gave you really unique advice that stuck with you?
Ken Daly, my predecessor, when he retired, I had dinner with him his last night here at NACD, and we were walking back from dinner, and he said, "Hey, I left a letter for you on your desk that I want you to take a look at tomorrow morning." And it was basically, I still have it here in my office. It was a list of about 20 things to consider as you lead the organization. And some of it was personal, some of it was professional, and some of it was really encouraging. But I thought, it was really exceptional for him to take the time to sit down and write that out in his hope that I would be successful as his successor. So I give Ken a lot of credit in terms of my leadership ability and what I've learned and what really sticks out to me. But he's one of many, and there are so many that have had an influence on me, as I mentioned before.
Yeah, that's powerful. Now, Ken certainly had a lasting influence on the organization, on you, and where we are today, I think, not just with the NACD, but the boardroom itself. So let's talk a little bit about the board itself, right? You've been observing it up and close over the last 25, 30 years. And a lot has changed, right? Perhaps not visible from the outside as much, but what do you think have been the biggest changes really since the beginning of this century in how boards operate and how governance itself is changing?
There's always the give back component of board service where individuals have served as executives and then they go on boards to give back and give their time. Many of them do it to stay engaged. They stay current on issues, and they want to help the company succeed. I think the focus that's been on boards has just changed dramatically, as I was talking about before. There's so much attention paid to what directors have done or what they haven't done, and so much scrutiny on the different aspects of board service. There's been such a radical shift, and I'll go back a little bit further than the beginning of this century, but to boards it was almost honorary service to be on a board. And now I look at it as it's a job, and the accountability is there. The time commitment is massive compared to what it used to be. I remember looking at proxies back in the 90s, and it wasn't uncommon to see people on 15, 17 boards because they didn't have to go to the meetings, and they weren't necessarily participating at the level that we see now, where it's hard for directors to be on 3, 4 boards, let alone 15, because it takes so much time. There's so much going on, and there's so much focus on the role of the board in helping the company succeed. So I think that shareholder focus, that general public focus, the media focus, and boards really turning into professional bodies as opposed to honorary boards where they weren't as active. And that's changed everything. It's changed the composition of the boards. It's changed how they work. It's changed the timeframes, as I mentioned, in terms of their time commitments on each individual board. So I almost look at your question the opposite way, is what hasn't changed, because everything has changed.
Peter, you mentioned directorship has become a job, right? A profession. And I think that may not be clear to this audience, who may look at directorship still as a somewhat ceremonial role. Not always clear what these individuals or part-timers who come in for dinners, for meetings, maybe a golf tournament. Talk a little bit what that means. Directorship is now so much more intense. It may actually be a profession or a job, like an auditor is a job.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the question is always, well, they're not full-time employees. No, they're not, and nor should they be. The idea is to have that independence to oversee management. But in terms of the professionalism, a lot of that has to do, again, with the time, the commitment that's there, the expectations that are on the boards. And it's not, I think about the pandemic and what directors went through in the pandemic when we just didn't know what was going to happen, right? Everything changed in the pandemic. And we had boards that were cash-strapped, whose supply chains had been completely disrupted, whose workforces obviously had gone remote. There were stories of boards meeting daily, audit committees meeting daily, boards meeting weekly. Sometimes, it just depended on the circumstances of the company. But when you're doing that and you're that involved, you got to know what's happening all the time with the company. And obviously everybody was in crisis. The world was in crisis. But boards had to step up and they had to figure out what was the best way forward for the company and how is the company going to survive. But I think it goes deeper than just the episode of the pandemic. I think about how the education component has changed, the expectations of the boards to stay current on issues. That's one of the reasons we launched our certification, was that for that reason, that boards and individual directors could demonstrate their proficiency in what the job is that's different than their management job, how they oversee, what they have to report on, how they interact with their shareholders, with their stakeholders, how the governance ecosystem is moving around them, and it's critical for them to be successful. So it's more than just show up and go to a golf tournament. It is a lot more regular meetings. It's a lot more accountability. It's a lot more responsibility, and it's a lot more scrutiny of the job at hand.
Yeah. So as I think about the folks listening, many of them may have the ambition to become a director, right? It's prestigious. It's the pinnacle in some ways of a career after the executive suite. But not everyone is cut out for that role, as you described, right? It's more intense. It demands incredible amount of focus and discipline. Talk to us a little bit about what that means as you're thinking about a potential directorship role. the do's and don'ts, right? What questions you should be asking yourself whether you're the right fit for this type of service?
Well, I get calls almost daily. At least once a week, I get a call from somebody that's looking for another board seat or their first board seat. And there are a variety of things to think about. But one thing that I think is critical is making sure you understand the business of the company that you're interested in and you like that business, because you may end up spending, as I just said in reference to the pandemic, you may end up spending a tremendous amount of time with the leadership of that organization, with your fellow board members. So if you're not really into it, it may be really difficult to manage that time frame. So getting to know the company and the board and really in liking the business that they're in, getting to know your fellow board members and what makes them tick, what are their backgrounds, to make sure that you've got a strong group of fellow board members that are going to support you and support the management team to be successful. Understanding what difficulties the companies may have had in the past and how you're going to contribute. I always ask, why me? Why do you want me on your board? What am I going to bring that's different than any of the other directors? Because I want to be complementary to the rest of the board and make sure I'm additive to that boardroom table. Because if I'm not, I can spend my time elsewhere and be more productive and more helpful to another company. So I think there are a lot of factors on both sides of the equation. Are you a good fit, number one, and is the company a good fit for you, is number two? And then that why question, why me? Why am I the one that you're asking to come serve on your board? Because if you don't have a good answer for that, it may eliminate the other two sides of that question.
Yeah.
So.
And Peter, related to that is also that major shift in mindset, right? We're likely dealing with very successful executives, players in industry who want to get on boards and perhaps deservedly so. But once they get on a board, they're no longer that operator, right? That executive that's in charge, that can dictate orders, has authority. Explain that, because I think for many folks listening, that's probably not entirely clear, right? Boards are certainly making tough decisions, but the way they work together is very different from the C-suite.
Yeah. And that's, you bring up an important point, Friso, which is the differential between boards and management. Boards are there to oversee, to hold accountable, to ensure that things are getting done by the management. Management manages the company. Boards oversee that management and help that management, but they're not the operators. And that's a big challenge for a lot of type A personalities to change that hat, so to speak, when they walk into the boardroom and not be the operator, because they spent their entire careers being operators and leaders. And now they've got to take on that different role, which is, very often a cheerleader and a supporter of management, but it's also, holding people accountable and making changes when changes need to be made and or suggesting changes that need to be made within the organization. But it all comes back to understanding the strategy, helping build and guide that strategy with the management team, and making sure that the management team is executing on that. And again, you're holding them accountable, but you're also endorsing them and encouraging them and paving ways for them in the marketplace. But you've also got that oversight and that responsibility to hold people accountable.
Yeah, and I think you described that really well. There's certainly accountability, but also helping management set the path, right? Setting them up for success. Often in the media, right, if you look at the big headlines involving particular companies, and we won't mention names, you see that where was the board headline, or the board was asleep at the wheel. The board should have had more expertise or should have made more decisions, right? Isn't that fair, given what you just described, or do we need to kind of dispel the myth that the board is omnipresent, right? Everywhere, digging into the details of the business. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and another great question, Friso, and you and I have had this conversation on sidelines before, but the expectation of where was the board, I think gets misplaced a lot of times, because there is that expectation that they're omnipresent. They're there in every meeting. They understand every facet of what's going on at the company. They can't. That's part of the beauty of the independence, is they can't be there day to day. They don't understand every little element of the organization. That's what management does. And I think about that expectation and where it gets misplaced sometimes, even as recently as the SEC's climate rules. Part of the challenge that we raised in our comment letter to the SEC was this notion that the board is setting emissions guidelines for the company, and how they're going to put these things together. Well, that's not the board's role. That's management's role. And I think they get conflated so often that people forget that the board members aren't there every day. They're not running the company. They're overseeing the management of the company and holding that management accountable. And that's a challenge, because I think the headlines, as you said, where was the board? How come they didn't do this? Why, and again, there are situations where they should have known certain things were happening, but there are others where that's not their role, is to be in the day-to-day management. That's not what they're there for. And that conflation is detrimental to me in terms of how people look at boards, because it is different than management, and people have to recognize that. Flip side is, as I mentioned, there are scenarios where some of the board should have known what was going on. They should have taken action earlier. They could have held management accountable in different ways, and or the CEO accountable in different ways. So one size doesn't fit all, so to speak, in terms of how you're looking at this. But we have to be careful that the expectation of what boards are doing and what they're not doing isn't out of proportion.
Yeah, and that makes the role so tough, right? Knowing when to actually step in and intervene and course correct. The signals aren't always there, right? At least not from management. And that demands some intuition and experience, right? To sense that.
Well, it does. And it's also, again, I'll take it back to strategy. One of the things we wrote in our Blue Ribbon Commission on strategy was that when management teams are presenting the strategy to the board, they very often are picking, their A game. This is what we want to present, and they go into sales mode. This is the strategy we want the board to approve. The board may pick through it, they may poke some holes in it, but the board should also be asking, what are alternatives that we weren't presented with? What are the assumptions that underlie this strategy, and are we going to pressure test those on a regular basis? Because those are some of the warning signs, right? If you've got 15 assumptions that underlie your strategy about certain things that are going to happen in the marketplace, certain events that are going to take place, and out of those 15, maybe you're only hitting 7 or 8, 6, 8 months, 10 months, 12 months down the road, where do you need to course correct? And if you don't know what those alternatives are, if you don't have those milestones that are outlined in the assumptions, you may not have that opportunity to course correct. But I think about, again, we'll go back to the pandemic or some of the recent supply chain issues we've had due to geopolitical activities. If you don't know what your secondary choices or third choices are, if you can't get your supplies to manufacture your product because something happens in some other part of the world that disrupts your supply chain, what are my alternatives? Where do I pivot? How do I think differently? What's our alternative strategy? All those have to be the questions that boards are asking as they're monitoring the performance of the company and the execution against the strategy that help you get to that point of being nimble enough to move. And that's where that experience that boards bring to the table, again, most of the board members have been operators in some fashion throughout their careers. They got to think like that a little bit as they walk into the boardroom. You can't check that experience at the door just because this isn't your company, you're not managing it. You have to think differently about execution and how you're overseeing that execution.
Yeah, it is this whole, and we talk about it in our work a lot, right? This trust but verify mindset. So if I put myself in the shoes of an emerging executive, right? It's my first time reporting to the board on strategy or risk. I'm nervous. I'm not sure how much detail to provide. I obviously want to impress them with my expertise, the details of my business. What advice would you have for that individual, right? To make sure they indeed hit at the right altitude to drive the right conversation.
This is where I think the beauty of some of our education comes into play, is understanding what the directors should be asking, what questions should be on their mind as they think about strategy and risk, as they think about how the company's operating. They have a mindset of how do I check on those assumptions? How do I check on those milestones? You can almost turn that around and think, all right, if I'm an executive going in to present to the board for the first time, I should know what they're thinking about. I should know what their expectation is around some of these issues and what they want to know, because then I can go in and address it and let them ask the questions that they want to ask. So you don't want to bombard them with so much information that is not relevant to the discussion, but it may be very relevant to you doing your job, but they don't need to know that much in the weeds, right? They need to stay on the surface, understand, are we on track? Are we not on track? What's gone wrong? What's gone right? What's changed since last quarter when you gave us a report? And again, this is your first report, so you may not have had that opportunity, but to look through the other board materials to understand what has been presented in the past, if this is your first time, and where the questions may lie. And then again, thinking about their role and how they're overseeing this organization, not managing it. What do they need to do? What do they need to know and to effectively do that?
Yeah, that's helpful. Certainly know your audience, right? Their prerogatives, what they've focused on in the past, the key questions they're concerned with. I think that's important because I think for many executives, that can be a very stressful career making or breaking moment. That's great. Let's get to a few points of passion that you have around some of these governance issues, right? Governance is not perfect, right? The system is not perfectly designed. There are some conflicts, there are some tensions woven into how boards are set up, how the corporate governance system operates. A few things that you often talk about, and you mentioned it earlier too, is board accountability for its own performance, right? Boards have a lot of autonomy. They self-regulate, they self-compensate, they self-nominate. They don't often hold themselves accountable for how well or how poorly they're performing, right? That's a black box.
Yeah, and you're getting to the annual evaluation of the board, which is critical and I don't think done very well at a lot of companies. I assume that's where you're going with your question, Friso, but because it is something that I've been passionate about. It is really, we spend our lives evaluating our direct reports as managers. You do it your whole career. You've gotten feedback your whole career. But for some reason, when we go into the boardroom, it becomes an assessment of the group as a whole, as opposed to the performance of the individuals on that board. And some boards do go deep, right? They're going to assess individual performance. They're going to have peer evaluations and really get at it. But a lot of boards don't. They assess, do we have good meetings? Do we end on time? Are we hitting the right agenda subjects, et cetera? But they're not necessarily finding out if, Bob is participating at the level that he needs to, or Mary is participating at the level she needs to. Are they asking the right questions? Are they engaged enough? And that's where I think we kind of fall down a little bit. And if you take that up a level, the average CEO tenure within the S&P 500 or the Fortune 500, I can't remember which was the stat, is less than 5 years, where the average tenure of a board member is well in excess of that. We're talking 8-10 years. Why is it easier to fire a CEO than it is to fire a fellow board member, is the question I always come down to. Is the performance that dramatic in terms of the bad performance of the CEO versus the mediocre performance of a fellow board member, that we would have that kind of differential? So I worry that we get out of balance with, the collegiality of the board versus really examining the performance of the individual directors the way we should, and get to, we've got to have the best group of people sitting around this table who are contributing in whatever ways they need to from their experience to help this company succeed. And I'm not sure we're really there yet in terms of evaluations.
No, you're right. And you've emphasized this in the past, right? Directors often age out or term out. Very few have the courage or are encouraged to step out earlier than that, when perhaps their knowledge is no longer relevant, right? Or their expertise has become obsolete.
Yeah.
That's hard to break.
I've actually been presenting to a board. This is years ago. I was presenting to a board about certain issues around independence and committee structures. And I literally had a director stop the meeting and say, I think I was a good director when we were an $800 million company. Now that we're a $3 billion company, I think I'm out of my league and maybe I need to step off the board. They literally stopped the board meeting. I was a guest as a faculty member, and I had to step out of the room, and they took a vote whether to keep him on the board. And they did, because obviously his contributions were valuable at the time. But I thought that was a bold move by him, just to say, maybe I'm not the right person any longer. I was probably very additive when we were smaller, but now we've kind of outgrown my expertise. That's a rare occurrence, I think. But I think it's critical for board members to think about. We always talk about age limits and term limits as seatbelt issues. Those are the things that are there as a backstop should you not be able to get somebody off of a board for a performance issue, or you don't want to address it as a performance issue. They'll eventually hit one of these seatbelt issues and have to go. If I had to choose between an age limit and a term limit for a board, I'd definitely choose a term limit, because age is arbitrary, and you can have highly functioning directors who are 75, but the age limit on the board was 72, so they're no longer contributing to that board. If you think about a really interesting structure would be if everybody had a 10-year term limit. Every board had a 10-year term limit. We would be able to move good directors from company to company, and you'd be able to spread that talent on a regular basis, and everybody would do it. The problem is, if only some companies do it, then other companies are locking up that talent. And somebody may say, well, 10 years is arbitrary too. And, I've got great directors who've been on my board for 12 years. Well, yeah, but they could also be serving another company, and you could bring in new talent. So we'd have this constant refreshment at boards. We're a long way from that, obviously, because more companies have age limits than they have term limits.
No, that's powerful, Peter. And a call to action, I think, for the community was so highly controversial. But as we think about the speed of technology, right, the speed of geopolitical, economic, social issues, you'll have to think some of this decision-making around offboarding may need to happen sooner. So, Peter, another issue you often talk about is board overreach into management, right? Noses in, but also fingers in. And the repercussions that has for board independence. We've seen that in some areas, right? The pandemic, often crisis management. Talk a little bit about the tension there. Sometimes boards will need to step in, as you said earlier.
Yeah, and you just gave two great examples. If there's a crisis at the company and or some sort of scandal that some element of management might be involved in, very often the board will step in and they'll get their hands in. Whatever expertise might be needed, maybe a board member will step in to help out. During the pandemic, obviously, we saw boards really step in to help with management. They were meeting more frequently. They got very involved in a lot of the issues with the company. But then as we came out of the pandemic, the expectation was that boards would settle back into their roles as oversight of management and not have their fingers in. And noses in, fingers out was coined by NACD's founder back in the 70s when he first founded the company. It's there's always debate about that because of the independence. And we just had a recent debate on this at one of the Blue Ribbon Commissions as to how far those noses in, fingers out goes. How far do you want those fingers in or out? And there's been a lot of variations on that over the years. I've heard noses in, fingers on the pulse, that kind of thing, because they're getting closer. That independence from a legal standpoint is critical. And you don't want the board running the company. You don't want them too in the weeds of the company because they've lost that independence. And from a legal perspective, you need to have that. So it is tough. And that overreach, besides the technical side of it where they're getting into management issues, it also changes the board management dynamic dramatically. And that's another challenge where all of a sudden the CEO is not the one in charge because there are two board members who are actively participating in something a little too deeply. And then the senior management or the CEO's direct reports on the senior management team then start to question, well, who's in charge, right? So you really need to keep that separation there where the board is in that oversight and supporting role, and management is running the day-to-day of the company. And that's why John was so prescient in that noses in, fingers out approach, because you want to know what's going on. You want to be able to sniff out the bad things with your nose, but you're not in there day-to-day with your fingers running the day-to-day operations.
Yeah, great points and good advice, I think, for those early directors, right? Who still have that operator mindset and want to dig in and find it really hard to shift their altitude.
Right.
So, Peter, imagine you were the SEC chair for a day or had another major regulatory role. What would you try to change in the current governance system? If there's one change you could make, one reform you could implement, right, irrespective of who's in charge politically?
That's a huge question, Friso. I am a big proponent of self-governance and how, if we have too many regulations, one size can't fit all. Every company's different. Every company needs to determine its own governance structures that are suitable and appropriate for the company at the time. And the board can make changes as the company grows. I get worried about too much regulation. So, one sweeping regulation that I would make is a big question, because I'm not a big advocate of too much regulation. I think the reporting mechanisms that have come to play, if you go back to Sarbanes-Oxley, you go through Dodd-Frank, even some of the rules that are coming out of the SEC, that information flow is critical to not just the shareholders, but to the stakeholder community at large, who are interacting with companies, the vendors to the companies, the community, the employees, everybody that has an interaction with a company has a stake here. That information is critical. It worries me when we're providing information for information's sake. So there's critical information, and then there's just information. And, I look at the size of proxies now. I don't even know what the average is anymore, but it's well beyond probably what anyone ever expected in the information flow. And I wonder who's reading it. Who's actually reading it, other than the proxy advisors and some of the large institutional investors who have, dedicated stewardship groups. These things are massive. And if you've got to vote 3,000 of them annually, you've got to have a massive team to dig through that information and find the right information. I think that may be one of the benefits of generative AI as we move forward, is really honing in on what's behind all this that I really need to know, because there's a ton of information there that I'm not sure is getting used the way it was intended. And we may have kind of put ourselves into information overload with some of the documents. So I recognize I'm speaking on both sides of it. I'm an advocate for information, but I'm an advocate for appropriate information and not too much information, because then things get lost. So I don't know how I would answer that question of one regulatory change, other than I still kind of fall back on, I like this idea of if we all had term limits, which I just referenced, that might be really interesting for boards and the success of boards to be able to transfer knowledge through their experienced directors going from one board to the other than waiting. I've been on the board for 17 years and now I'm 75 and I got to go off and I'm never going to get on another board because I'm 75 and everybody has an age limit. Again, can we transfer some of that knowledge to other companies earlier via a term limit?
Very well, Peter. Very good diplomatic answer as a CEO. I understand the point about disclosures and compliance. I think you're right. In some ways, it may also detract attention at the board level on strategy, right, on growth, when the disclosures become unsurmountable and just too much of a burden for management and the board to get right. One big question we often hear about, more from the academic community, sometimes from investors, and it's treacherous terrain, is the relationship between good governance and growth, right? Firm performance, financial performance, shareholder returns. Libraries have been filled with studies to understand if there's causality there. The evidence is never conclusive. how would you describe the impact of good governance? Right? Do we need to desperately search for that link with growth, or is that misplaced?
You know, I've been part of many of those studies, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And I tried to do one years ago with the Milstein Center, and we were looking at, this is back when the ISS ratings in the CGQ were prevalent, I guess early 2000s or mid 2000s. And we looked at high scoring through independent raters of governance and firm performance on a 5-year basis. And I think we had to have a score of X or above, which was, in the top 20% of all firms rated, and 5-year performance above, I think it was 8% at the time. And when we narrowed it down, there were 14 companies that came out of the S&P 500, and 11 of the 14 were oil and gas companies who were in boomtown at the time, right? So we had different factors that were impacting performance. And that's what always throws these studies off is you have economic cycles, you have business cycles, you have geopolitical cycles that impact company performance, and you may have high performers in certain elements simply because of the environment. And it really isn't a huge operating issue that the company's outperforming on an operating basis. They're just in an upcycle for their industry. So it's really hard to correlate the two things. I think the opposite is true, though. If you have really bad governance, you're going to end up with bad performance. It may not be, year one or year two, but down the road, you're going to have bad performance. And that has shown time and time again, even in startups where we have, luminaries that have been on boards and the company just fails miserably because they're not focused on the oversight the way they need to. They're not asking the right questions. So it's really hard to prove the positive corollary. I think it's a lot easier to prove the negative. And I think it's just, you think about good board management relationships that are in that check and balance mode that we've talked about throughout this program, that are really overseeing management, that are holding people accountable, that are checking on the assumptions, that are checking on the performance milestones, that are asking the right questions so that we don't get false positives and that things look really great when the underlying assumptions aren't there to protect long-term value creation. That's when we run into problems. And, so again, I think it's really hard to prove the positive, but if you've got bad governance in the long term, you're going to have poor performance.
Yeah, great point, Peter. And it's often true that boards are most needed when companies are struggling, right? Whether they're facing a disruption from another competitor, the industry, a major existential crisis internally, right? When companies are not at their best is when boards need to step up,
right?
So it may be somewhat counter-cyclical. The board is performing well when the organization needs them in order to withstand major shocks.
Right.
So one thing the NACD has done, I think, even sooner than many other players, representatives in the industry, is to focus on board diversity, right? And recently, inclusion. We launched a major report, I think it was in 2012, 2013, on board diversity. Talk a little bit about our journey there and how we're trying to raise the next generation of diverse directors.
Great question. And, I remember when we did that report, it wasn't planned. And it was something that our board was discussing in terms of we're trying to look out over the horizon as to what are the big issues that are facing companies or will be facing companies. And the board actually threw that at us and said, I think we need to really go after diversity. And we did. And I'll never forget, we came up with a list of barriers and how you overcome those barriers to diversity. And I remember going to present to a different group about this. And I had the report, and I think the report had been out for about 12, 18 months at that point. And I was sitting in the audience going through the different notes and different points, key points of the document. And a woman came up and stood in front of the table that I was sitting at and looked down and said, where did you get that report? And I said, well, this is the NACD Blue Ribbon report on board diversity. And she went, wow, I wish more people had access to something like that. And I thought, well, you do. You just don't know it's there. So, but, we were out really trying to think differently about how boards need to overcome some of these barriers. And some of them can be pretty simple. And for instance, the barrier that we used to hear quite a bit is, well, I don't have room on my board to add any diverse directors. My board's full. Well, if you look at company bylaws, very often it will state that the board can be anywhere between 8 and 15 directors, and we've chosen 12. Well, that gives the board latitude to increase their size. So one of the things we said is, well, you can increase your size by 2, bring on 2 diverse directors, not kick anybody off. So you're not replacing directors. You're adding directors who can then be part of the board, have that knowledge gain over the next few years until 2 directors hit retirement age or hit their term limit or whatever seatbelt issue they have, or they step off. So you get that institutional knowledge transfer, and you're adding diversity, but you're not kicking somebody off in order to add diversity. So that was just one of the barriers that we looked at, and how do you overcome. And I'll never forget, about 2 years later, I was at another program, and this discussion came up, and one of the directors sitting around the table said, we've really been innovative. We expanded the size of our board and brought 2 diverse directors on, but we didn't have to kick anybody off. And I went, he read the report, right? So we were trying to be out there thinking about how do you add different perspectives to that boardroom dialogue. And, one of the things I always say is the real estate around your boardroom table is probably some of the most valuable real estate that any company owns. And you need to get the right people sitting around that table to take advantage of that. And the more diverse perspectives you can get into the room, who think differently about your customer base, who think differently about your supply chains, who think differently about your strategy, you have a more fulsome discussion. You have a greater potential to have a better decision making with different perspectives in the room. And that's what we were trying to get at, is to add diversity to increase that percentage chance that you're going to make better decisions in the boardroom.
Yeah, Peter, we've been a real catalyst over the last number of years in calling for change through education. I know we launched our Center for Inclusive Governance 2-3 years ago, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the idea behind that is, again, the BRC you just referenced, Friso, was 2012, right? So that was 12 years ago we put that report out. There's been a massive movement around the diversity front over the last 5 to 7 years. Actually, probably about 10, 12 years since that report came out, if I go back in time. And much needed and much warranted movement around the diversity space. Probably not where it still needs to be. What we were finding, and that's why we went after this Center for Inclusive Governance, was that we were getting we were getting diversity, but not inclusion. And it doesn't help to have the diversity around the table if you're not including those voices, if you're not listening, if you're not engaging the folks around the table. So we created this Center for Inclusive Governance to look at companies that had done this really well. And it's out in front of our firewall. It's open to the public. It's there to help companies do better by providing examples and providing ways that companies can think about collecting that voice, or those voices, collecting that input from the directors who are sitting around the table, and making sure it's not just diversity, but you have that inclusion so that we get that input.
Great. So we covered a lot of ground, Peter, over the last hour about the evolution of the boardroom, dispelling some of those major myths involving the board and the governance system. You talked about directorship becoming a job, directorship becoming more demanding, right? Demanding a different mindset. What does that ideal director of the future start to look like? Let's say you move forward 5 years from now. What do you think will be key in terms of skills, backgrounds, competencies, in addition to obviously the diversity you just talked about?
That's a tough question to answer, because there's not one perfect director. And I think that's why we have boards, so that you have multiple backgrounds, you have multiple skill sets who are discussing these issues and coming together. So it's not like I could have a magic cookie cutter and all the directors are going to have this great background. The the diversity of those backgrounds, skill sets, experiences are what we need. So you're going to have multiple different players here. I think the attitude and the approach to board services is where we need to think about that perfect director. And I think that would be somebody who is intellectually curious, who's a continuous learner, who's has to stay current, who's, I don't want to say, technologically an expert, but who is digitally capable and inquisitive, who's, again, that goes back to the learning side of it, and somebody who's nimble and ready to change. Business is changing so fast. The requirements to be in business are changing so fast. You talked about the geopolitical, the political landscape. There's just so much happening, and the speed of change in our business environment is so fast now, and the expectations are so much greater. We've got to have people that are ready for that and ready to step in when they need to, step back when they need to, go learn and take on the new skills that are going to be required to serve on that board in whatever industry it may be, to fill the gaps on the board where experience isn't there. So I think there's that nimbleness is going to be critical for directors to think differently about. It's not just the experience that I had, it's the experience that I can gain if I do this job right.
No, those are really wise words as we think about the future of directorship and the boardroom itself. Maybe one final question, Peter. Hopefully I can sneak one more in. NACD itself, right? We've been around for more than 45 years, influential as a catalyst. What do you think is the major contribution of NACD to this governance world, right? The building up of the board community, if you have to isolate one? I know there are many.
Well, I think you just hit it, actually, and that is the boardroom community. The ability, or our position as the convener, and whether that is convening board members with other board members, convening committee chairs with committee chairs, or committee members with committee members, or convening us with the stakeholder groups. We've had multiple meetings, and we tend to bring in the shareholders, the large institutional shareholders, with the directors, so they hear their concerns, and the shareholders hear the directors' concerns. We have media in the room, so they're understanding exactly what is happening at some of our meetings. We don't have it at all of them, obviously, but they get to hear what are the key concerns and what are directors focusing on. So that's the beauty of NACD to me, is the fact that we bring people together, and then we publish on that. So it's the convening power of the organization. It's the network that we have created among the directors who can share experiences, learn from each other. And we can then take that and publish it and share that on a broader scale with those who couldn't be in the room, so that there is this continuous learning. And that's, to me, what is so powerful about NACD, is the community that we've created with our 24,000 members who are in many cases leading in this world and are sharing their experiences with others, so they can improve themselves.
Yeah, the community is incredibly powerful. And every listener, think about your journey in a boardroom. NACD is a resource for you. You'll learn from your peers. It is a way to accelerate your development in the board. And Peter, the only other thing I would highlight about the NACD in this difficult, sometimes polarizing environment, right? Our longevity and neutrality really stand out, right? We've been for this community here for more than 4 decades, with research guidance that's based on facts, on deep research, on using the network to identify leading practices and approaches.
And our position as the voice of the directors in this larger ecosystem is critical, right? We use that with the regulators. We use that with legislators. We use that with our peers in the marketplace. As we have this network of directors. There is a voice behind it, and we're going to represent what's important to the director community through that voice. And that may turn into our research. It may turn into our education, but it can also be used to help shape, as we provide comments on regulatory activities. It's what's important to the directors. What are the key concerns for us so that we can do our jobs better?
Well, Peter, thanks so much for being with us for the hour. I know we covered a lot of ground. I think you illuminated a lot of issues in the boardroom, hopefully demystified some myths and misperceptions folks may have had about what boards do and don't do and how they operate. I thought it was incredibly insightful, and soon many of our listeners will learn from that and think about Pete's advice in their journey to board service. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you, Friso. It's great.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.